When the technologically advanced Vraxx Empire invades what they consider a primitive human farming colony on Terra Nova, they discover that generations of agricultural innovation and resourcefulness make Earth's farmers far more formidable opponents than expected. Commander Zextal's third heart quivered with barely concealed disdain as the holographic display showed Terra Nova's vast agricultural expanse below. Endless squares of cultivated land stretched to the horizon, broken only by what his sensors identified as primitive storage structures and scattered habitation units. The Vraxx Empire had conquered 12 star systems, yet here they were, about to waste valuable resources, subduing what appeared to be nothing more than dirt pushers, with delusions of interstellar colonization. Preliminary scans complete, Commander, Lieutenant Vix announced, her crystalline sensory nodes pulsing with data. Population approximately 50, 0 humans. Primary occupation, agricultural cultivation. Military presence, negligible. Most significant technology appears to be automated harvesting units and atmospheric moisture regulators. Zextal's upper lip curled, revealing iridescent teeth. These humans left Earth to become farmers? Of all the possible pursuits in the galaxy, they chose to dig in dirt? They do appear to be quite efficient at it, Commander, Vix noted, scrolling through data streams. The colony produces enough food to supply 3 neighboring systems. Irrelevant. The Empire requires this world's strategic position, not its primitive food production. Deploy the first wave. I expect minimal resistance. Below, Sarah stood in her family's central control hub, watching the Vraxx ships descend through Terra Nova's atmosphere. Fourth-generation farmer and agricultural engineer, she'd spent her entire life learning the intricate dance between technology and nature that had made Terra Nova the breadbasket of this sector. Now, those same skills were about to be They're positioning for a standard orbital deployment, she announced to the gathered council of farm leaders. Just like we predicted from the Centauri incident last. Her father David nodded grimly. Have all sectors initiated protocol? Sarah checked the neural interface linked to their agricultural management system. The display showed hundreds of green confirmation dots across the colony map. All sectors' moisture regulators are at maximum capacity. Soil density has been adjusted to optimal defensive parameters. Harvester drones are in position. They think we're helpless farmers. Eleanor Martinez, head of the Hydroponics Guild, said with a fierce grin. They have no idea that every single piece of equipment we use has been modified for exactly this scenario. The first Vraxx dropships punched through the cloud layer, their energy shields dispersing the moisture with purple flashes. Sarah allowed herself a small smile. Those shields were about to encounter something very different from standard atmospheric. All sectors, she broadcast through the colony's agricultural network. Execute phase. Across the vast farmlands, thousands of moisture regulators, devices normally used to ensure optimal growing conditions, simultaneously act. But instead of their usual gentle atmospheric manipulation, they released precisely calculated bursts of chemically treated water vapor, calibrated to a specific resonance frequency. Through the control hub's windows, Sarah watched the Vraxx ship's shields flicker and distort as they encountered the altered The aliens' energy field harmonics, analyzed months ago from leaked combat footage, proved just as vulnerable to agricultural chemistry as she'd theorized. Impressive, her father admitted, watching 3 dropships veer off course, their shields failing. They'll have to land first, Sarah replied, activating her neural link to the Harvester drone network. And we've prepared quite a welcome in Sector. The remaining Vraxx ships, presumably adjusting their shield frequencies, pushed through the chemical cloud. They headed directly for the most obvious landing zone, a vast, empty field that appeared to be. Commander Zextal watched the resistance attempt with mild amusement. Primitive atmospheric manipulation. Is this truly their best Sir, Lieutenant Vix interrupted, her sensory nodes flickering with concern. I'm detecting unusual readings from the surface. The soil composition. The rest of her warning was lost as the first dropships touched. Instantly, the seemingly solid ground beneath them transformed into a precisely engineered quicksand, created through months of careful soil density manipulation and subsurface fluid dynamics. The massive ships began to sink, their energy shields useless against the simple physics of strategically liquefied. Zextal's 3 hearts pounded in asynchronous rage as he watched the chaos unfold. Impossible! These are simple farmer! Sarah's voice crackled through every Vraxx communication channel, her words translated perfectly by their own systems. Simple farmers who've spent generations learning to turn hostile worlds into gardens. Did you really think we only used that knowledge for growing crops? The invasion of Terra Nova was about to become far more complicated than a simple planetary subject. The real battle was just beginning, and the Vraxx Empire was about to learn exactly what it meant to underestimate those who had mastered the art of bending entire ecosystems to the Vraxx ground forces emerged from their partially submerged ships like angry insects, their crystalline armor refracting the morning sunlight. They expected to find panicking farmers fleeing their advance. Instead, they encountered precisely engineered chaos. Lieutenant Kriax led his squadron across what appeared to be a simple irrigation channel, only to have his advanced targeting systems completely malfunction. The water wasn't water at all, but a carefully calibrated solution of minerals and agricultural compounds that created an electromagnetic disruption field, something the farmers used to protect sensitive crops from solar radiation, now repurposed for warfare. These readings make no sense, Creek snarled, his sensory appendages twitching in frustration. How are they masking their positions with fertilizer? Sarah watched the aliens' confusion from her mobile command center, a modified harvesting rig that stood 3 stories tall on massive Through her neural interface, she could see every sector's status, watching as generations of agricultural innovation were transformed into defensive strategies. Deploy the pollinators, she ordered, and across the fields, thousands of tiny drones, normally used to fertilize crops, swarmed into action. Each one carried a payload of highly concentrated natural pesticides, harmless to humans, but causing havoc with the Vraxx's sensitive crystalline respiratory system. Impossible. Commander Zextal raged from orbit, watching his ground forces stumble and scatter. Their technology is primitive. Sir, Lieutenant Vix interjected. I'm detecting complex, algorithmic patterns in their drone. They're not just repurposed farming units. They're displaying sophisticated swarm intelligence. Sarah allowed herself a grim smile as she activated the next phase. The massive irrigation towers, which usually provided carefully measured water to the crops, now demonstrated their secondary. With a series of pneumatic bursts, they launched nets made of ultra-strong fiber, originally developed to protect sensitive plants from Terra Nova's fierce storms, across the alien formation. You see, Sarah broadcast on all frequencies. When you spend generations learning to protect crops from everything a hostile planet can throw at them, you learn a lot about defensive warfare. Every piece of equipment we use has to serve multiple purposes. Efficiency isn't just about saving money, it's about survival. The Vraxx soldiers found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to understand their every weakness. When they tried to use their energy weapons, they discovered the very soil beneath their feet had been treated with compounds that absorbed and dispersed energy. Their attempts to gain higher ground were thwarted by fields that suddenly became unstable. Years of soil composition knowledge turned into tactical advantage. Fall back to Point Delta. Creeks ordered his remaining forces, only to find their designated rally point suddenly flooded by the farm's sophisticated irrigations. The water carried suspended particles that stuck to their armor, rapidly hardening into a concrete-like substance. Another, simple farming technique, usually used to stabilize erosion-prone areas. From her command rig, Sarah coordinated the defense with the precision of someone who understood every square meter of their land. They think farming is just about pushing dirt around, she told her father, as they watched the Vraxx forces struggle. They don't understand that we're terraforming engineers, biochemists, and ecological warfare specialists, all rolled into one. The first wave of the Vraxx invasion force had been effectively neutralized, not by advanced weapons or traditional military tactics, but by the sophisticated tools and techniques developed over generations of agricultural innovation. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. The Vraxx wouldn't underestimate them twice, and their next attack would be far more serious. They'll bring in their heavy weapons next, her father warned, studying the orbital readings. All this clever farming equipment won't stand up to orbital bombardment. Sarah's eyes gleamed with determination as she pulled up the schematics for their grain silos. massive structures that held far more secrets than just their harvest. Then it's time to show them what we've been growing in Sector 12. After all, some crops take years to mature, and some defenses take generations to prepare. The battle for Terra Nova was about to enter its next phase, and the Vraxx Empire was about to learn that underestimating farmers wasn't just a mistake. It was possibly the last mistake they'd make in this sector of space. From his command ship, Commander Zextal deployed his elite crystalline devastators, massive war machines that towered over the agricultural landscape. Their translucent bodies hummed with concentrated energy, capable of reducing entire cities to ash. Surely, he thought, these simple farmers would now understand the futility of resistance. Sarah watched the massive forms descend through her colony's atmosphere, their crystalline structures refracting sunlight into deadly prismatic patterns. But where the Vraxx commander saw overwhelming force, she saw opportunity. Years of studying light refraction to optimize crop growth had taught her exactly how crystalline structures behaved under stress. "Initialize Project Greenhouse," she commanded through her neural link. Across Terra Nova's vast farmlands, thousands of automated climate control towers began adjusting their settings. These towers, normally used to maintain perfect growing conditions for different crop varieties, now served a very different purpose. "They're deploying some kind of atmospheric modification," Lieutenant Vix reported, her sensory nodes pulsing with confusion. "But the energy signatures are agricultural in nature?" The crystalline devastators marched forward, their enormous feet crushing carefully tended fields beneath them. But as they advanced, something strange began to happen. The precisely calibrated mixture of humidity, temperature, and carefully selected atmospheric compounds, usually used to stress plants into producing specific beneficial mutations, began to affect the living crystal of their bodies. "Status report," Zextal demanded as the first devastator stumbled, its crystalline structure developing microscopic fractures. "Sir, they're using basic atmospheric controls to induce crystal fatigue," Vix replied, her voice carrying undertones of disbelief. "The same principles they use to force plant evolution are weakening our devastator's structural integrity." Sarah directed the defense from within one of the colony's massive grain silos, but these structures were far more than simple storage facilities. Over generations, the farmers had developed them into hardened bunkers, their walls reinforced with bioengineered plant fibers stronger than steel. Inside, she stood before a bank of controls that would have looked more at home in a military command center than a farming community. "Begin Phase 2, she ordered. Across the colony, seemingly ordinary pieces of farming equipment revealed their hidden purposes. Fertilizer distribution systems, originally designed to enrich the soil, now sprayed highly corrosive compounds that ate away at the Vraxx's crystalline technology. Harvesting machines transformed into mobile weapons platforms, their cutting beams, calibrated through years of precision farming, slicing through weakened crystal with surgical precision. But the true surprise came from deep within the colony's experimental fields. For years, the farmers had been developing new plant strains capable of surviving extreme conditions. Now, these bioengineered crops showed their defensive capabilities. Massive vines, their growth accelerated by carefully controlled hormone releases, erupted from the ground to entangle the devastator's legs. Plants that had evolved to survive in highly acidic soil released spores that furthered the crystalline degradation. "Impossible," Zextal raged as he watched his elite forces falter before what appeared to be simple agriculture. "These are farming techniques." "No," Sarah broadcast back, her voice calm but firm. "This is generations of scientific advancement disguised as farming. Every challenge nature threw at us became an opportunity to innovate. Every crop failure taught us new ways to adapt. You saw primitive food producers, but what you're actually facing is a colony of environmental engineers who've spent decades learning to reshape worlds." The devastators struggled against their organic restraints, their weakened crystalline structures creaking under the strain. When they attempted to use their energy weapons, they discovered another farming innovation turned to warfare. The fields themselves had been treated with energy-dispersing compounds, technology developed to protect crops from solar flares, now repurposed to render energy weapons nearly useless. From her command center, Sarah activated the colony's network of weather control satellites, officially registered as agricultural climate management systems. These satellites, normally used to ensure optimal growing conditions, now focus their combined power to create localized atmospheric disturbances, the resulting storms, precisely targeted through years of weather manipulation experience, further stressed the devastator's already compromised structures. "We're not just farmers," Sarah explained to the increasingly desperate Vraxx commander. "We're terraformers, geneticists, environmental warfare specialists. Every season is a battle against nature itself, and we've never lost." As if to emphasize her point, the first crystalline devastator collapsed, its weakened structure finally giving way under the combined assault of agricultural innovation turned to warfare. Others quickly followed, their supposedly invincible forms succumbing to generations of farming knowledge repurposed for defense. But Sarah knew the battle was far from over. The Vraxx still had their orbital fleet, and their commander's wounded pride would demand an even more dramatic response. She turned to the hollow projection of Terra Nova's surface, watching as her people's agricultural expertise continued to prove more formidable than any conventional military force. "They'll try biological warfare next," she mused, already calculating contingencies. But they don't realize they're facing a colony that spent generations developing countermeasures to every conceivable biological threat. After all, protecting our crops from disease isn't so different from protecting ourselves. The next phase of the battle would test everything the farmers of Terra Nova had learned about biological defense. But Sarah couldn't help but smile. The Vraxx were about to discover that declaring war on farmers meant facing opponents who had spent generations preparing for every possible threat, even ones they hadn't known they were preparing for. The Vraxx fleet's massive bioweapon deployment ships moved into position above Terra Nova, their smooth obsidian hulls reflecting the planet's sun like dark mirrors. Commander Zextal had finally lost all patience with what he'd originally dismissed as a simple farming colony. If they couldn't be conquered conventionally, he would simply make their precious farmland uninhabitable. "Deploy the xenofungal spores," he commanded, his three hearts beating in vengeful synchronization. "Let's see how these agricultural specialists handle a biological agent engineered specifically to destroy their food supply." Sarah watched the dark clouds descend from the Vraxx ships, already analyzing their composition through the colony's advanced atmospheric monitoring systems. These same systems, designed to detect the earliest signs of crop-threatening conditions, now served as their first line of defense against biological warfare. Just as we predicted, she broadcast to all sector leaders, "Initiate Protocol Blight." Years of defending crops against rapidly evolving agricultural diseases had prepared Terra Nova's farmers for this moment. Every field contained sophisticated biological countermeasures, dormant until needed. As the xenofungal spores descended, they encountered an ecosystem that had been carefully engineered over generations to respond to precisely this kind of— "Sir," Lieutenant Vix reported, her crystalline sensors flickering in confusion. "The spores are being consumed." Zextal leaned forward, his sensory appendages quivering. "Consumed? By their plants, sir. They appear to have engineered their crops with some kind of adaptive immune response. The xenofungal spores are being broken down and repurposed." Sarah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction as she watched the colony's defenses in action. "My great-grandmother developed the basis for our adaptive crop protections," she explained over the command channel. "Every season, we face naturally occurring blights that could wipe out our harvest. Did you really think we wouldn't be prepared for artificial ones?" But the true surprise came next. The repurposed xenofungal material, processed through the colony's engineered crop systems, began producing its own spores, ones that specifically targeted the crystalline biology of Vraxx technology. What the aliens had intended as a devastating weapon had become, through generations of agricultural bioengineering knowledge, a defense mechanism that turned their own tactics against. "Impossible," Zextal raged, as reports came in of ship systems being contaminated by the modified spores. "They've weaponized our own biological aid." "No," Sarah corrected. "We've done what farmers have done for millennia. We've adapted. Every threat to our crops becomes an opportunity to improve our defense. Your engineered weapon just became part of our ecosystem. The Vraxx commander watched in horror as the modified spores began affecting his fleet's crystalline-based technology. Systems started failing as the organic components of their biotech ships encountered Terra Nova's engineered countermeasures. What had been designed to destroy crops was now threatening to disable his entire invasion force. Sarah coordinated the colony's response through their agricultural management network, now revealing its full capabilities as a military command and control system. Every sector reported success as the engineered crops processed and repurposed the Vraxx bioweapon. The fields of Terra Nova, far from being destroyed, were demonstrating just how sophisticated simple farming had become. You should understand something about farmers, Sarah broadcast to the increasingly desperate Vraxx commander. We're not just people who grow food, we're guardians of entire ecosystems. Every season brings new threats, new diseases, new challenges. We've spent generations learning to protect our crops from threats you couldn't imagine. It's just another blight to be overcome. The situation in orbit deteriorated rapidly as the modified spores spread through the Vraxx fleet's biocrystalline. Ships began losing power as their organic components succumbed to Terra Nova's agricultural defense. The mighty invasion force found itself being defeated not by weapons of war, but by the sophisticated biological engineering of people they dismissed as simple dirt farmers. Commander Zextal faced a decision he'd never imagined making: retreat, or risk losing his entire fleet to what was essentially a sophisticated crop protection. His pride warred with his tactical training as he watched more ships report critical system failure. Perhaps, Lieutenant Vix suggested carefully, her sensory nodes dimmed in submission. As the Vraxx fleet began their hurried withdrawal from Terra Nova's orbit, Sarah stood in her family's fields, watching the stars through the clearing atmosphere. The ground beneath her feet was alive with the activity of billions of microorganisms, each one part of their colony's sophisticated biological defense. Above her, the automated irrigation systems continued their normal patterns, once again devoted to their primary purpose, nurturing life rather than defending against invasion. They never understood, she said to her father as he joined her. Farming isn't about forcing nature to do what you want. It's about building something sustainable, something that can adapt and survive. We didn't just build farms here on Terra Nova. We built an entire civilization based on understanding and working with complex living systems. The stars continued to shine as the last Vraxx ship disappeared from their sensors, leaving behind a colony that had proved farming was far more than simply growing crops. It was about mastering life itself. In the aftermath of the Vraxx fleet's retreat, Terra Nova faced an unexpected crisis. The interaction between the alien bioweapons and the colony's defensive ecosystem had created an unforeseen consequence. The modified spores, while effective against the invaders, had begun to affect the delicate balance of the colony's carefully engineered agricultural system. Sarah monitored the emerging situation from the colony's central agricultural laboratory, where banks of sophisticated biological sensors showed cascading changes throughout their engineered ecosystem. The defensive adaptations they'd created were proving too successful, threatening to overwhelm the very systems they were designed to. The modified spores are replicating faster than our control mechanisms can handle, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the colony's chief botanist, reported. They're becoming too efficient at breaking down crystalline structures, including some of our own essential mineral formations in them. Sarah studied the complex data streams flowing across her neural interface. The situation was dire, but she recognized something in the pattern of spread, something that reminded her of the colony's early days, when they'd faced their first major crop. "We're thinking about this wrong," she announced to the gathered council of agricultural specialists. "We're trying to fight the spread, but what we really need to do is integrate." Remember what my great-grandmother always said: in farming, there are no problems, only opportunities for new growth. Working through the night, Sarah and her team began reprogramming their soil management systems, not to fight the modified spores, but to guide their evolution. They used techniques developed over generations of crop development to slowly alter the spores' behavior, transforming them from a threat into a new component of Terra Nova's agricultural ecosystem. "Look at these readings," Sarah explained to Commander Zextal, who had returned under a flag of truce to observe their solution. "Your bioweapon, combined with our defensive adaptations, is evolving into something entirely. The modified spores are now helping to break down mineral compounds in our soil, making them more accessible to our crop. The Vraxx commander's sensory appendages twitched in disbelief as he watched the real-time data. What had been intended as a weapon of destruction was being transformed into a tool for agricultural and the sophisticated biological engineering that had defeated his fleet was now demonstrating an even more impressive capability: the ability to adapt and incorporate hostile elements into something beneficial. Your knowledge of biological systems is far more advanced than we understand, Zextal admitted, his crystalline form reflecting the lights of the laboratory. We saw primitive agricultural techniques, but what you've actually developed here is the result of generations spent learning to work with living systems rather than trying to dominate, Sarah completed. Every farmer knows that the best solutions come from understanding and adapting to nature's own patterns, not fighting against. The crisis had become a turning point, not just in the battle for Terra Nova, but in the relationship between the colony and the Vraxx Empire. As the modified spores settled into their new role in the colony's ecosystem, both humans and aliens found themselves learning from each other's approaches to biological engineering. Perhaps, Zextal suggested, watching as a field of wheat displayed unprecedented growth thanks to the newly integrated spore system. There are things we could learn from your agricultural method. Our own attempts at biological engineering have always focused on control and destruction. We never considered the possibilities of adaptive integration. Sarah smiled as she led the Vraxx commander through fields that were already showing the benefits of their latest agricultural innovation. The crisis had been averted not through further conflict, but through the application of farming's most fundamental principle: the ability to transform challenges into opportunities. That's the thing about farming, she explained, running her hands through the enhanced wheat stalks. It teaches you that every problem contains the seeds of its own solution. You just have to be patient enough to let them grow. In the months following the failed invasion and subsequent crisis, Terra Nova underwent a remarkable transformation. What had begun as a desperate defense against an alien threat had evolved into an unprecedented collaboration between human farmers and Vraxx biotechnologists. The farming colony became a symbol of how different approaches to science and survival could merge to create something extraordinary. Commander Zextal, in his final report to the Vraxx High Command, formally recommended the establishment of a permanent scientific exchange program with Terra Nova. These, he wrote, have developed an approach to biological engineering that challenges our most fundamental assumptions. Their agricultural techniques, far from being primitive, represent a sophistication we had not thought possible without advanced crystalline technology. Sarah found herself leading the newly established Interspecies Agricultural Innovation Center, where Vraxx crystalline engineers worked alongside human farmers to develop new hybrid technology. The modified spores that had once threatened both sides now formed the foundation for revolutionary farming techniques that combined human adaptive agriculture with Vraxx crystalline biotechnology. The secret, Sarah explained to a group of visiting alien scientists, was realizing that our greatest strengths lay in different approaches to the same goal. Where you sought to control biological systems, we learned to guide them. Where you developed weapons, we created tools for. By combining these perspectives, we've opened up possibilities neither of us imagined alone. The impact extended far beyond Terra Nova. Other human farming colonies began adopting the hybrid techniques developed there, while Vraxx worlds started experimenting with more adaptive approaches to their own biological. The incident became a case study in how conflict could transform into cooperation when both sides were willing to learn from each other. 1 year after the invasion, Terra Nova hosted the first interstellar agricultural conference. Representatives from dozens of species gathered to learn about the colony's innovative farming methods and the new technologies born from the human-Vraxx collaboration. The sight of various alien species working alongside human farmers in the experimental fields became a common. Commander Zextal, now serving as the Vraxx agricultural liaison to Terra Nova, stood with Sarah in her family's fields on the anniversary of the invasion. They watched as crystalline growth structures, guided by modified spores, created perfect supports for climbing plants, a harmonious blend of both their technologies. We came here thinking we would find primitive farmers, he admitted, his sensory appendages moving in what Sarah had learned was amusement. Instead, we found teachers who showed us a whole new way of thinking about biological systems. Sarah smiled, reaching down to touch the soil that now contained elements of both human and Vraxx engineering. "That's the thing about farming," she said. "It teaches you that growth often comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes what looks like an invasion can turn out to be cultivation in disguise." Above them, the stars shone on a colony that had not just survived an alien invasion, but had transformed it into an opportunity for growth that would benefit both species for generations to come. Terra Nova stood as living proof that even in the vastness of space, the wisdom of those who worked with the land could bridge the gaps between worlds.